Yeah, I mean, it's great coming in here, just like them cheering for us, and just it's like they familiar with us and stuff. And then like I'm not sure, I don't think all of them want to be basketball players, but like just giving them ways of like what I learned from basketball to put it in my life. So just teach them lessons that I learned through basketball and teach them, and hopefully they take it and help with their lives.
We are here with all the green room invites at the 2025 NBA Draft.
What's your favorite individual play of your entire basketball career? Is it hands down?
Yeah, tying your buzzer beater.
It's got to be, right?
Yeah. People sleep on Nebraska. Nebraska was loud.
Okay. What one NBA player are you most excited to play against?
Braun or Harden.
Everyone's been saying Braun. I like it. Let's keep it rolling. Derik, thank you so much, and we'll be back with more prospects.
Yeah.
You ever had anybody dress you like this?
Yeah, I was in a wedding.
Overall feelings on the day?
I'm excited. I'm just tired of guessing. Like, I can't wait. Both sides.
And I know you were playing it cool yesterday. Nerves hit yet?
Nah, not yet. Probably when I sit down.
Just to see this guy, make it, live out his dreams, is a blessing, you know what I'm saying? And just for him allowing me the opportunity to be a part of it, I'm forever grateful. The Maryland band will be out there waiting for us like they did at 20.
I bet they is, but they love me.
Yeah, he would.
I love Maryland.
That is decent. Details.
Good evening, and welcome to the 2025 NBA Draft.
It's definitely a gift from God. I'm definitely proud of him and his endeavors. I'm looking forward to see him in the next level.
He's out of Maryland, Derik Queen.
All right, the pick is in. It's time to get it back to Commissioner Silver.
With the 13th pick in the 2025 NBA Draft, the Atlanta Hawks select Derik Queen from the University of Maryland.
Some clear excitement from the fans here in Barclays Center. And right there, Derik told me that sharing this moment with his mom and doing something great for her means absolutely everything to him. His mom made so many sacrifices to be able to get to this point.
He's not your today's big what everybody looking for, meaning being athletic and being a live threat at the basket. He has a high motor. He's relentless when it comes down to rebounding, and he has that soft, featherly touch around the basket.
We got to go through your basketball last 3 months or so. The game winner, or in the NCAA tournament, or tonight. I need you to rank both of them.
Definitely tonight. Definitely, because I might hit another game when you never know, but this is a one-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Congratulations to Derik Queen.
Atlanta was the only team between number 6 and number 15 that Derik Queen did not work out for. This is Atlanta's pick. It's getting shipped to New Orleans. The Pelicans franchise was absolutely enamored with Derik Queen.
Zion Williamson, when he's healthy, unreal. You have a rising star in Trey Murphy. How will you fit in there to that roster?
Similar to my senior year. We about to have 4 people that's getting drafted, and then I fit in great. I made plays for my teammates. I rebounded. Sometimes it wasn't my night, so I can fit in anywhere and be effective anywhere.
You got to have an IQ. You can't just be tough and nothing else. And I put his IQ in the game up against anybody in this draft. Like, this is a super, super high IQ guy.
I'm so happy. I mean, it was definitely exciting. It was a lot of me asking questions, probably getting on my agent nerves.